A few months after the verdict, a letter arrived on my desk. No return address. Just a single sheet, folded twice. It's not over for me, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. There are others. I'm showing them what to ask. You showed me the system could listen if you speak its language loud enough. I've started writing it down. A guide, maybe. Not for court. For survival. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. I kept that letter tucked behind my ID card, right where the badge used to remind me who I worked for. Now, it reminds me who I fight for. The first thing they handed me that morning was a folder. Manila, creased, heavier than most. The kind of weight that doesn't come from paper alone. On the tab, scrawled in all caps, State of California versus Devontae Price. 17 years old. Grand theft auto. Possession with intent to distribute. Resisting arrest. The kind of triad that usually ends in a plea before you finish your first coffee. I scanned the file on autopilot, flipping past the charge sheet, arrest report, and evidence log without feeling much. After a few months in this office, numbness becomes muscle memory. Devontae Price. Another name, another case, another kid probably going down. It's safer to think that way. To assume the worst. Efficiency depends on it. If you start looking too closely, start wondering who they really are, you won't survive a week in this job. My caseload was already overflowing. The office printer hadn't stopped whining since I clocked in. Emails blinked like slow, pulsing alarms. And somewhere in the background, someone was yelling over a vending machine that ate their last dollar. Another day in the basement of a system that keeps churning, whether or not anyone's listening. But something about the folder stuck. Maybe it was the ink smudges, the way the edges had been handled too often, too roughly. Maybe it was the photo stapled to the first page, Devontae staring dead into the intake camera with a calm that felt less like fear and more like defiance. Not smirking. Not pleading. Just staring back. Hard. Still. The officer's notes were brief. Uncooperative. Minimal verbal engagement. Refused to answer questions. That was supposed to mean hostile. But it read more like strategic. It read like a kid who already understood the rules and had chosen not to play by them. The arrest narrative hit all the usual beats. Fleeing the scene. Cocaine in the glove compartment. No fingerprints. A single witness, name barely legible, claiming to have seen someone matching the defendant near the vehicle earlier that afternoon. And the linchpin, tower-based GPS data, locating Devontae's phone within a 1-mile radius of the crime scene at 4:42 p.m. I'd seen stronger cases. I'd also seen weaker ones win in front of tired judges and in different juries. Still, there was something dissonant here. The facts were neat, too neat. They read like a checklist instead of a narrative. And Devontae's photo, that glare, had lodged in the back of my mind like a sliver I couldn't ignore. I kept reading. The discovery packet was thin. No mention of the liquor store camera across the street from where the car was found, though it was marked in the police report. No indication that footage had been pulled. No analysis of the drugs beyond basic composition. Chain of custody forms and signed. The usual oversights. The kind that don't matter when no one's looking closely. Normally, I wouldn't have. But I paused. Not because I believed him innocent. I didn't know him yet. But because there was something in the file that felt rehearsed. Like the story had been told too cleanly, too confidently, as if the ending had already been written before the beginning was finished. Devontae's eyes in that photo still held me. They didn't say, help me. They said, try me. I closed the folder and rubbed the tension out of my neck. My body felt heavy, dragged down by the accumulated weight of names I'd never remember and sentences I couldn't shorten. The truth of this work wasn't injustice. It was in math. How many cases? How many hours? How many ways to make the impossible palatable? I hadn't always thought like that. I came into this office believing in the work. That I could be the line between mercy and neglect. That I could speak for those no one else would listen to. But belief wears thin under pressure. Somewhere along the way, I'd started confusing survival with surrender. 10 weeks in, and already I'd learned to move fast, speak less, avoid eye contact. Most clients didn't want explanations. They wanted deals. And most of them, guilty or not, were too tired to fight. But Devontae? Something told me he wasn't tired at all. Our first meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp. I expected the usual, a slouched teenager, averted eyes, shallow answers. Instead, when I opened the door to the interview room, I found him sitting straight-backed, hands clasped on the table like he was the one waiting for me. His stare met mine immediately. Unblinking. Appraising. It wasn't disrespectful. It was something worse. It was judgment. There was no panic in his posture, no nervous twitching. He looked like someone who'd been rehearsing this moment for months. Someone who already knew what I was going to say before I said it. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence made its point. You're late. You're tired. You're not ready. And beneath that, I am. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, the folder still in my hand, suddenly aware of how heavy it felt again. For the first time in weeks, I didn't know how to begin. I'd walked in expecting a case. Instead, I'd found a mirror. And I didn't like what I saw looking back. Some clients talk too much, trying to fill the silence with explanations that don't help them. Others barely say a word, too scared or hardened or worn down to believe any of it matters. Devonte Price did neither. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just watched me. And the longer I stood across from him, flipping through his file, the more I felt like the one being evaluated. There was nothing frantic about him. No desperation. Just precision. He radiated the kind of focus I'd only seen from prosecutors rehearsing closings, controlled, measured, intentional. Like he was tracking something in me, looking for proof of whether I could be trusted or counted out. I'd been told the smart ones were the hardest. The ones who read too much, asked too many questions, thought they understood the system because they'd seen it swallow people like them. But no one warned me what it would feel like to be across the table from one who actually did. When I sat down across from him, he didn't move. His fingers stayed laced together. His eyes held steady. He didn't lean forward or shift away. There was no performance, no attempt at manipulation. It was like he'd already decided what I was going to do before I'd even started. That file between us, thin, incomplete, probably the same one the DA had breezed through on their coffee break, it suddenly felt more important and more fragile. Because if I missed something, he wouldn't. There were notes inside, not from the arresting officer or the prosecution, but scrawled on a loose piece of notebook paper tucked behind the discovery. I hadn't seen it earlier, must have been stuffed in after intake. No label, no formatting. Just a list. Timestamps. Footnotes. 3 bullet points labeled, unverified. 4 lines of case references. All written in clean, even handwriting that didn't match the usual panic scribble I saw from most defendants. For a moment, I thought someone had misfiled an internal note. But then I saw the signature at the bottom, written small and centered like a stamp of ownership. D. Price. It wasn't just a list. It was a breakdown. The GPS data? He flagged it as tower-based, not satellite-verified. He'd cross-referenced 3 case precedents where similar data had been deemed insufficient in isolation. The cocaine? No fingerprint record. Chain of custody had a signature gap from the first evidence locker. The witness? No physical description logged, just the phrase matched defendant's profile, with no citation of clothing, height, or voice. Devonte had circled that line and written, profile is not equal to identity. He wasn't guessing. He dissected it. I sat there for a long moment, rereading his annotations, trying to decide whether I felt impressed or threatened. Maybe both. Because what Devonte had done wasn't just smart. It was prepared. And preparation like this didn't come from instinct. It came from necessity. This wasn't just a kid trying to prove a point. This was someone who had been planning. Somewhere, between the arrest and our meeting, he'd studied every page of the case against him like his life depended on it. Because it did. And I, the one with the degree, the title, the key card that opened doors he couldn't enter, hadn't bothered to look that closely until he forced me to. I hated how familiar that felt. Not the case, but the apathy. The slow surrender to the workflow. It had crept in without me noticing, like mold in the corners of a room you stopped cleaning. I used to tell myself I was different, that I'd be the one who fought harder. But somewhere in the blur of endless files and never enough hours, I'd started aiming for good enough instead of right. Devonte had noticed. Of course he had. That's what this list was, a test. A challenge. A quiet confrontation from a teenager with no legal standing but all the leverage in the world. And I had walked into it unprepared. I spent the rest of that afternoon combing through the case file. Not skimming. Not rushing. Reading it the way I should have from the start. And the more I read, the more his notes made sense. The gaps were real. The assumptions were sloppy. The story wasn't airtight. It just looked that way because no one had bothered to pull at the seams. There was no camera footage from the liquor store. No verification that the witness even knew Devonte by name. The drugs were processed, but no prints had been run, just field-tested and logged. And the arresting officer, Daniels, had a quiet trail of complaints buried in internal records. Nothing that made headlines. but enough to raise questions. The kind that rarely get asked when the defendant looks like him. I found myself sitting in front of the computer, looking up case law I hadn't reviewed since school, searching for the precedents he'd cited. They weren't just accurate, they were strategic, carefully chosen, relevant. He hadn't just read the cases, he'd understood them. And that's when the shame really settled in. Because if a 17-year-old defendant could spot the weaknesses in the state's case better than the attorney assigned to defend him, then what exactly was I doing here? I was supposed to be the advocate, the safeguard, the one person in the courtroom whose only job was to stand between a young man and the full weight of a system already leaning toward his conviction. Instead, I'd walked in assuming he was just another file to move down the line. That night, I brought the case file home, something I hadn't done in weeks. I stayed up rereading every document, every notation, every missing link. And in the silence of my apartment, under the soft glow of a desk lamp that hadn't been turned on in too long, I realized something I didn't want to say out loud. I wasn't ahead of this case. I was trying to catch up to a teenager who had already figured out what I'd been too tired to see. The first motion I filed on Devontae's behalf wasn't anything dramatic. No cinematic courtroom twist. Just a simple request, verification of surveillance footage from the liquor store mentioned in the arrest report. It was procedural, straightforward, something that should have been done from the start. And yet, it felt like setting off a fire alarm in a building where no one had noticed the smoke. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I submitted it. My supervising attorney didn't say anything outright, but I caught the glance, half curiosity, half warning. Motions like that weren't part of the routine. We were supposed to streamline, not slow things down. The court moved fast, and we were expected to move with it. I filed 3 more the next day. Chain of custody audit. Witness credibility assessment. A challenge to the admissibility of the GPS data based on tower-only triangulation. It was the kind of work we were trained to do but rarely given the time or backing to follow through. The prosecution responded quickly. No extensions. No accommodation. Just clipped rebuttals and a slight change in tone. I was no longer the passive court-appointed formality they were used to. I was a nuisance now, one that was getting in the way of a clean win. And in our line of work, nuisances don't last long. Around the office, people started noticing. Quietly at first. A nod in the hallway. A heavier pause when my name came up during calendar review. Defenders don't like disruptions. Most of them were already treading water, and anyone who rocked the boat too much risked making it harder for everyone else to float. I heard a senior attorney say my name behind closed doors. Not in praise. In warning. Something about how new blood always burns bright before it burns out. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. And I carried that sentence with me like a caution label printed on my own skin. Still, I kept digging. Devontae had given me more than a head start, he'd given me a roadmap. But he wasn't asking for help. That's what made it harder. He wasn't waiting for someone to rescue him. He was waiting to see if I would keep up. There was a shift in our second meeting. Not in what was said, he remained mostly silent, but in the way he watched me. His stare wasn't testing anymore. It was weighing, as if some internal scale was being adjusted. He didn't thank me. He didn't smile. But something in his posture loosened, just slightly, and that was enough. By the end of the week, I knew the case better than any I'd worked in months. I'd read the officer's history, combed through the 911 dispatch logs, and found an inconsistency in the timeline that hadn't been flagged in the report. None of it was enough to make the case collapse, but it was enough to raise doubt. Enough to challenge the story that had been filed and forwarded like a press release. In court, the judge gave me that same expression I'd seen before. Polite fatigue. Mild impatience. But when I spoke with clarity and confidence, when I cited precedent and pointed to evidence gaps, something shifted in her tone too. Not warmth, she didn't have it in her, but recognition. I wasn't coasting, and that confused her. The prosecution, on the other hand, grew colder. Faster objections. Sharper responses. A new level of control in their language, as if they'd switched from autopilot to active defense. I saw the DA glance at me during a pre-hearing sidebar. Not the way you look at an opponent, but the way you look at someone who's off script. That's what I'd done, unintentionally. I'd veered off script. Our office had won, whether anyone admitted it or not. A rhythm of surrender, dressed up as strategy. Take the deal. Don't push too hard. Don't waste capital on the cases you're not going to win. Especially not for kids like Devontae. Ones who don't smile, who don't beg, who don't make it easy to see them as victims. We weren't trained to win. We were trained to manage loss. But Devontae had refused to accept that. And now, so was I? There was a price, of course. More hours. Fewer allies. A kind of slow social isolation that crept through the walls of the office like mold. You start missing coffee invites. People stop dropping into your office to vent. Your name doesn't come up in after-hours drinks. I noticed it, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Because once you see the machine for what it is, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how judges glance at case files before they glance at faces. How prosecutors smile at plea bargains like they're gift-wrapping someone's future. How defense counsel, myself included, sometimes talk more about times served than actual innocence. You start hearing it in your own voice. In the words you use. In the silences you let stretch too long. The machine doesn't blink. It doesn't pause to ask if it's right. It moves. And if you stay still, it carries you with it. But Devontae had shown me the break in the rhythm. The gap between narrative and truth. And now that I'd stepped into that space, I couldn't go back to pretending it wasn't there. I found myself reviewing other files late at night. Ones I hadn't questioned before. Old plea deals I'd recommended. Cases that closed too fast. Stories I didn't bother to hear. I started wondering how many times I'd smoothed over something that should have been challenged. How many kids walked into courtrooms carrying truth no one had time to recognize. And I started asking a question I hadn't allowed myself to ask in months. What if I've been doing it wrong? Not just this case. All of it. Courtrooms are built for performance. Everything from the wood-paneled walls to the elevated bench says, watch, but don't interfere. Speak, but only when allowed. It's theater wrapped in procedure, and like all good theater, the outcome often depends less on truth than on timing. I used to think my role was to keep the play moving. Stay in character. Say the lines. Don't trip over the script. But sitting at that table beside Devontae, I realized the role I was handed didn't fit anymore. I wasn't playing defense. I was resisting choreography. Opening statements were uneventful. The prosecution recited the charges with the ease of someone reading from a teleprompter. The stolen BMW. The cocaine in the glove box. The GPS ping. The witness sighting. Their tone was calm, confident, tidy. It sounded like they'd already won. I let them speak. I took notes, but not for the facts. I already knew those. I was watching for tone, for emphasis, for the story they were selling. And when they sat down, there was a brief silence. The kind that asks, is there anything else? I stood slowly. Not theatrically. Just deliberately. My voice didn't rise. I didn't posture. But every word I said was chosen with precision. This wasn't a rebuttal. It was an unmasking. We began with the GPS. The prosecution's entire timeline hinged on a single point. That Devontae's phone had placed him near the stolen vehicle at 4:42 p.m. What they didn't say was that the data came from tower-based triangulation, not satellite GPS. It put him somewhere within a 1-mile radius. In a dense stretch of South LA, a 1-mile radius included parks, businesses, schools, and yes, a community rec center, where Devontae had clocked in for a shift at 4:30. I presented the timesheet. Then the footage. Grainy but clear. Devontae sweeping the lobby at 4:41. No narrative. Just fact. The courtroom shifted. Not audibly. But you could feel it. A ripple of something beneath the surface. Doubt. Maybe. Or discomfort. The prosecution objected. Something about authentication. The judge allowed it. Begrudgingly. Next came the witness. The state's only named civilian observer was a man named Gerald Kane. In his statement, he claimed he saw someone matching the defendant's appearance, standing near the BMW hours before it was reported stolen. But Kane had filed 2 false reports in the past 5 years, both later withdrawn. One accusing a neighbor of breaking into his shed. Another involving a teenager on a bike that turned out to be his own grandson. I didn't accuse Kane of lying. I simply submitted the public records. Exhibits D and E. Let the facts sit in the air like dust settling in light. Then came the drugs. Plastic baggies. Unlabeled. No prints. No camera footage of Devontae entering the vehicle. No forensic tie. The officer who collected the evidence, Daniels, was the same one who had racked up 3 internal complaints in the past 18 months. One of them, still under investigation, involved a traffic stop where meth was found in a glove compartment, after the driver had already been cuffed. None of that made the evidence disappear. But it made it move. It made it slippery. The prosecution began to bristle. Their objections became sharper, their tone colder. The DA, Mr. Langford, leaned into his cross-examinations with a familiar tactic: overwhelm. Throw out jargon. Interrupt. Reframe. I didn't match his pace. I stayed slow, deliberate, because I'd finally learned the secret no one says out loud in court. Desperation is loud. Confidence is quiet. Langford asked me why Devontae ran when officers arrived. I said he didn't. I said the report didn't note a pursuit, only that he moved away quickly. I asked the court to consider whether a 17-year-old, seeing two officers approach near a high-profile crime scene, might have walked away instinctively, not because of guilt, but fear. The judge didn't respond. But she didn't object, either. I wasn't speaking to her. Not really. I was speaking to the 12 strangers behind the witness rail. A jury that had walked in expecting this to be simple. Now, they weren't so sure. I saw it in the way their eyes shifted. How they started watching the prosecution instead of just listening. How the woman in seat 9, middle-aged, silent, unmoving, tilted her head slightly when I laid out the inconsistencies in the officer's timeline. They weren't ready to believe Devontae, but they weren't ready to believe Langford anymore either. At recess, no one spoke to me. Not the prosecution, not my colleagues. Even the bailiff avoided eye contact. Devontae sat still, hands folded, same as always. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But the wall between us, the one built from mutual doubt, had crumbled. In that moment, I realized I wasn't defending a client anymore. I was defending the idea that the system could be challenged. And the courtroom didn't know what to do with that. When proceedings resumed, Langford tried one last card. A photo, 2 years old, low resolution, of Devontae shirtless with a group of teens outside a liquor store, throwing up what he claimed were gang signs. It wasn't evidence. It was narrative. He didn't need the jury to believe it proved anything. He just needed them to feel like it fit. I objected. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just 2 words. Relevance, Your Honor. The judge paused. Looked at the photo. Then looked at Devontae. Then at me. Objection sustained. That was it. No gavel slam. No applause. Just a moment where the weight shifted again. A moment where someone in power, just briefly, chose not to follow the script. And for the first time in this entire case, I felt it. Not momentum. Not victory. Just permission. Permission to keep pressing. To keep questioning. To keep pushing the machine, even if it didn't blink. Because for once, it had flinched. There's a specific kind of silence that falls before a verdict. It isn't peace. It's pressure. Like the walls are holding their breath. Everyone in the room goes still, waiting for a truth no one controls anymore. Not the judge. Not the lawyers. Not even the defendant. Just 12 people and the weight they carry between them. The clerk read it flatly, the way clerks always do. Detached. Practiced. Count 1, grand theft auto, not guilty. Count 2, possession with intent to distribute, not guilty. Count 3, resisting arrest, not guilty. There were no gasps. No whispers. Just the dull hum of realization, like the system itself was confused about what just happened. The judge gave a single nod. The prosecutor stared at his papers like they might rewrite themselves. Devontae didn't move. His hands remained folded in his lap, his face unreadable. Controlled. As always. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. All I felt was air coming back into my lungs after days of holding it in place. The trial was over. But the confrontation was just beginning. Outside the courtroom, no one waited for me. No congratulations. No press. Just a long hallway with echoing footsteps and scuffed linoleum. A quiet that felt too honest. No courtroom drama music. No swelling orchestration. Just breath. Just the dull ache of survival. I found myself in the restroom afterward, standing in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection like it belonged to someone I hadn't met before. The same suit. The same tired eyes. But something beneath the skin had shifted. I'd walked into that trial thinking I was the only one with tools. But Devontae brought armor. He'd studied the terrain before he was ever accused. He'd prepared for a trial he never should have faced, because he understood something I was only starting to see. The system is built on assumptions, and once you're caught in it, truth becomes secondary to narrative. I thought I was helping him. But the truth is, he called me back to life. The next morning, I sat in my office staring at the manila folder that still bore Devontae's name. It was closed now. The case dismissed. But I couldn't bring myself to file it away. Not yet. I kept tracing the edges like they held something unfinished. Because what do you do when the system you work for almost chews up a kid who never should have been in its mouth? What do you do when you realize that, without even meaning to, you'd nearly helped it swallow him? I thought about the motions I hadn't filed in other cases, the questions I hadn't asked, the gaps I'd skimmed over because the next hearing was already waiting. I thought about the deals I'd encouraged, not because they were just, but because they were efficient. Devontae had stood at the edge of that conveyor belt and refused to lie down. And in doing so, he'd forced me to look at every case I hadn't stood up for. Every quiet moment when I'd chosen ease over fight. I didn't feel proud. I felt responsible. A few days later, I reopened a case I'd already closed. A young woman, 19, caught with stolen property in the back seat of a car her boyfriend had driven. No prints. No footage. Just proximity. She'd taken a deal for 2 years, scared of the 5 she was threatened with. Now I wasn't sure that deal should have been offered. I started pulling transcripts, highlighting inconsistencies, calling people who wouldn't call me back. Not for Devontae, not even for redemption, just because I'd remembered something I'd forgotten. The job wasn't supposed to be survival. It was supposed to be defense. The system hadn't changed. The court still buzzed with its same fluorescent drone. Judges still ran the calendar like a clock no one dared slow down. Prosecutors still smiled through sentencing recommendations like they were discussing office budgets. But something inside me had changed. My speed. My attention. The questions I asked. I started reading intake files differently. Not for charges, but for context. I started asking defendants what the police said to them before the cuffs. I started noticing who got written up for noncompliance and who didn't, and why that distinction always followed the same racial and economic lines. Devontae hadn't just exposed a weak case. He'd exposed a weak habit, one I had let become muscle memory. And the scariest part? I almost missed it. Weeks later, I heard his name again. Not in court, not in the news, just in passing. Another defender mentioning him as that kid who represented himself. The myth had already started growing, but they didn't understand what made him remarkable. It wasn't just the prep work. It wasn't just the notes. It was that he refused to be small. He refused to make himself easier to process. And that refusal, that defiance of the system's most basic demand, is what shook it, even for a moment. That moment changed me. Not because it proved something, but because it exposed something. This job will always be heavy. But now, I carry it differently. I know what to listen for. I know when to stop and ask again. And I know the cost of silence. The system still moves. The docket still grows. The calendar still fills faster than the coffee pot. But now, when I sit across from someone, I don't see a file. I look for the list behind the file. The hands that folded. The eyes that didn't flinch. And the questions no one else bothered to ask.